My mother texted me the night before Thanksgiving and told me not to come home. They were throwing a celebration for Andrew, a real surgeon, she said. It would be awkward if I were there because my office job was hard to explain, and no one would really understand it anyway. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone in my hand, reading that message over and over. The word real stayed on the screen longer than the rest. I expected it to hurt. It didn't. What I felt was something colder, clearer, like a room after all the furniture has been quietly removed. Outside my window, traffic moved as usual. Inside, everything slowed down. I realized this wasn't about a holiday or even Andrew. This was about where my family had decided I belonged and where I didn't. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy stories like this. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really do read them. After that message, I didn't reply. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and watched the screen go dark like it was finally done saying what it needed to say. The room stayed quiet. My breath slowed. And in that quiet, I understood something I had been circling for years, but never named out loud. My name is Lauren Whitaker. I was 29 that year, and I was the chief strategy officer of a biomedical technology company valued just over $4 billion. On paper, my job title sounded abstract, almost evasive. Strategy, vision, planning, words people use when they don't know where the real work happens. But every morning when I walked into the building before sunrise, the security guard nodded like he knew exactly why I was there. So did the people already waiting in the labs upstairs. I oversaw 11 research divisions spread across 3 states. 1,600 people reported directly or indirectly into decisions that landed on my desk. Engineers, neuroscientists, clinical trial leads. People whose hands shook when results came back inconclusive, because inconclusive meant someone somewhere would keep suffering a little longer. I didn't wear gloves, I didn't stand under surgical lights, but I decided which projects lived long enough to reach a human body and which ones ended quietly in a spreadsheet. At 28, I stood on a stage at the MIT Tech Review Summit and spoke about neural implants like they were fragile promises instead of products. I remember the lights were too bright, and my mouth tasted like metal from the microphone. Afterward, a man with gray hair and a military posture shook my hand and said very softly, "You understand consequences." That stayed with me. None of that ever made it home. To my parents, I was still the daughter who worked in an office, the one who sat in meetings and talked in circles, the one who didn't have a skill you could point to or a uniform you could admire. When they spoke about me to friends, their voices flattened as if they were describing traffic or weather, safe topics, unimpressive ones. I graduated from Stanford with a debt that followed me like a shadow, $290,000, neatly itemized, impossible to forget. I paid it down month by month while my older sister Melissa moved through life unburdened. Her tuition, her apartment, her emergencies, all handled quietly, lovingly. She had chosen the straight road. I had taken what my mother once called a long detour. They like to say Melissa lived in the real world. I lived in ideas. So I stopped correcting them. I stopped explaining what my days actually looked like. I learned how to nod at dinner and let conversations pass over me like cold air. It was easier to let them believe I was nothing than to keep proving I was something they didn't value. Silence became efficient, protective. Meanwhile, my fingerprints were all over the work they praised. When Andrew talked about breakthroughs in surgery, he was often describing procedures shaped by funding models I had built. When my parents admired innovation from a distance, they were admiring outcomes I had argued for in rooms with no windows and no applause. I watched their pride land everywhere but on me, and I learned to stand very still while it happened. That Thanksgiving message didn't exile me from their table. It clarified my position. I wasn't being pushed out of something I belonged to. I was finally being shown where I had always been standing just outside the frame, holding the structure together unseen. And for the first time, that realization didn't make me smaller. It made everything else line up. I still went to the dinner before Thanksgiving. Not the holiday itself, just the early gathering my parents insisted on, the one they framed as casual, harmless. I told myself it was easier to show up than to explain why I wouldn't. That was a lie I had learned to tell convincingly. Andrew arrived late, wearing a dark vest that still held the sharp lines of a tailor's hand. He filled the room before he even sat down. His voice carried confident and polished, the way people sound when they're used to being listened to. Every story circled back to him: long hours, impossible cases, lives altered because his hands had been steady when others hesitated. I sat at the corner of the table, hands folded around a glass I hadn't touched. I watched how my parents leaned toward him without realizing it, how their faces softened in that familiar way. Pride, uncomplicated, easy. When someone asked what I was working on, Andrew answered before I could. He looked at me with a half smile, the kind that pretends to be curious. "She's in strategy," he said. "For some biotech company." I told him the name. He nodded, unimpressed, like he was checking a box. "Oh," he said. "So, external support stuff." There it was. Clean. Dismissive. Small enough to fit neatly between courses. My father chuckled, the sound dry and approving. "Lauren's always been better with ideas than pressure," he said. "She's not built for the real thing." The real thing. The phrase settled in my chest and stayed there. I didn't correct them. I didn't explain that the project Andrew was praising, some breakthrough he described with theatrical pauses, was one I knew down to its failure rates. He talked about a neural implant trial like it had appeared fully formed, a miracle pulled from thin air. I remembered the weeks I spent arguing for its funding, the nights I reread outcome projections until the numbers blurred. I remembered signing off on a clinical direction that made several senior advisors uncomfortable. Andrew talked about the operating room. I thought about the conference call where we decided which patients would qualify, knowing the ones who wouldn't might not get another chance. Different rooms, same wait. No one asked how I knew so much about his case. No one noticed the way I stopped eating when he mentioned a complication we'd flagged months earlier. I sat there nodding occasionally, performing attentiveness the way I had learned to perform invisibility. My name is Lauren Whitaker. I was 29, the chief strategy officer of a biomedical firm that shaped the future of neural surgery. That night, I was just the quiet daughter who didn't quite measure up. I watched my mother refill Andrew's glass before it was empty. I watched my sister smile like this story had always belonged to her. The room felt crowded, but I had never felt more alone in it. When dessert came, I stood and said I had an early morning. No one protested. My father nodded like he had expected it. Andrew barely looked up. I put on my coat slowly. I remember the sound of the zipper, how loud it felt in a house full of voices. As I stepped outside, the air was cold enough to sting. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, letting the quiet settle my hands. From the sidewalk, the house looked warm, lived in, whole. I realized then that I had been standing inside it my entire life, hoping someone would turn toward me and really see what I carried. Instead, they saw what they understood. And I finally understood what that meant. I got in my car and drove away before anyone noticed I was gone. I drove home that night with the radio off. The road was empty, stretched thin by fog, and I let my thoughts settle into the rhythm of the tires. By the time I reached my apartment, the sting of the evening had dulled into something quieter. Not gone, just stored. I slept lightly, the way you do when something unresolved is already waiting for morning. 2 days later, back at work, my assistant left a folder on my desk without saying a word. She didn't need to. The weight of it was familiar. Final round candidates always arrived like this, thick, deliberate, carrying the last version of someone's story. My name is Lauren Whitaker. I was 29, and I served as Chief Strategy Officer for a biomedical company whose clinical decisions reached operating rooms across the country. I didn't rush when I opened the folder. I never did. Rushing was how people made emotional decisions and later pretended they were practical ones. The name sat at the top of the page. Dr. Andrew Keller. I stared at it longer than I meant to, not because I was surprised. Something in me had already adjusted to the idea quietly, like a muscle preparing for impact. Andrew had the pedigree they liked: clean training path, confident recommendations, a resume that photographed well. On paper, he looked inevitable. The position he was applying for wasn't symbolic. It wasn't ceremonial. I had designed it myself after 2 years of watching clinical leadership fracture under unclear authority. Senior Clinical Director. Equal in power to a medical vice president. Oversight across trials, surgical integration, patient outcome metrics. The role answered directly to the executive board. And to me. Andrew didn't know that. Most applicants didn't. They assumed strategy lived somewhere above them, abstract and distant. They imagined a committee, a faceless process. They never imagined a person who read every line twice and remembered what had been said at dinner tables. I turned the pages slowly. Publications, affiliations, outcomes summarized into neat columns. I recognized the trials he referenced. I remembered the internal debates they had sparked. I remembered which risks we had accepted and which ones we had declined. Andrew described his work as decisive. The data told a more careful story. Outside my office, the building hummed with its usual restraint. Glass walls, soft footsteps, conversations that dropped to murmurs when doors closed. This was the environment my parents couldn't picture when they thought of my job. They imagined a desk and a screen. They didn't imagine this silence or the way it pressed back. I emailed my assistant and asked her to schedule the interview. Monday, the Monday after Thanksgiving. 8:30 in the morning, early enough to strip away bravado, late enough to feel deliberate. When she confirmed the time, I closed the folder and placed it back on the desk. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel dread. What I felt was alignment. The kind that happens when two lines finally cross after running parallel for too long. That weekend, my family gathered without me. I knew the shape of it without seeing it. The table, the laughter, Andrew's voice carrying just a little farther than the others. I imagined my absence explained away easily. Work, meetings, deadlines, my office job. They were right about one thing. I was working. I spent Sunday evening alone in my apartment reviewing materials I already knew by heart. Not because I needed preparation, but because I wanted clarity, the kind that doesn't waver under familiarity. I poured a glass of water and watched the city lights blink on outside the window, each one steady, unconcerned. By then, the situation had stopped feeling personal. That, I think, was the most dangerous part. When emotion falls away, only responsibility remains, and responsibility has no room for comfort. Monday morning came quietly. I arrived before most of the floor lights were on. I straightened the folder one last time, aligned it with the edge of the desk, and sat back in my chair. In my parents' eyes, I was still the daughter who sat in meetings and spoke in theories. In that room, I was the final signature, and in less than 24 hours, Andrew Keller was going to find out who had been sitting across from him all along. At 8:28, I was already seated. The room was clean in the way executive rooms always are, glass table muted, lighting a single screen dark on the wall. I aligned my notebook with the edge of the table and folded my hands on top of it. My name is Lauren Whitaker. I was 29, Chief Strategy Officer, and this was not my first final interview. It was just the first one where silence mattered more than questions. Andrew arrived exactly on time. He walked in with the ease of someone who expected to be welcomed. His posture was open, relaxed, the faint confidence of a man who believed the room was already on his side. He nodded at the empty chairs, glanced toward the screen, and then his eyes landed on me. The shift was immediate. Small, almost polite, but unmistakable. For a fraction of a second, he didn't move. His hand hovered near the chair he had been about to pull out. The confidence didn't disappear. It recalibrated, scrambling for footing. He masked it, quickly offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and sat. I didn't acknowledge the recognition. I never do. Power doesn't announce itself. It waits. I reminded him that the interview was being recorded, standard procedure for senior clinical roles. My voice was even, administrative. He nodded, still smiling, though his shoulders had gone slightly rigid, like someone bracing against a draft they hadn't expected. We began where all interviews should begin, with the work. I asked him to walk me through his approach to integrating neural implant technology into orthopedic surgical pathways, not in theory, in execution. Timelines, risk thresholds, patient selection. I didn't rush him. I watched his hands instead. The way they moved when he spoke. The way they slowed when numbers approached. He spoke confidently at first. Broad language. Familiar phrases. Innovation. Collaboration. Patient-centered outcomes. The words filled the room but didn't land anywhere specific. When I asked for recovery benchmarks, he pivoted. When I asked how his approach differed from existing protocols, he circled back to experience. Experience is a comfortable place to hide when the data doesn't cooperate. I waited until he finished before responding. I always do. Interrupting only gives people somewhere else to retreat. Then I pulled up the trial summaries on the screen behind me. Not dramatically. Just enough light to change the temperature of the room. I pointed out the discrepancy between his reported outcomes and the controlled trial averages. A few percentage points, not catastrophic, but consistent. Enough to matter when scaled across real patients. Enough to matter when lives were measured in margins. I didn't accuse. I didn't editorialize. I stated it the way I would state the weather. Andrew leaned back slightly, as if distance might soften the numbers. He said recovery rates varied, that his cases were complex, that perfection wasn't realistic. I let that sit. Then I told him our benchmarks weren't built around realism, they were built around accountability, and that our clinical leadership was expected to design systems that improved outcomes, not explain why they didn't. That was when the smile finally disappeared. Not all at once. It thinned first, tightened at the edges. His eyes flicked briefly toward the recording light, then back to me. The room felt heavier, though nothing had changed physically. Even the air seemed to pause, waiting. I could see the moment it clicked for him, not who I was, but what I was doing. This wasn't a formality. This wasn't a courtesy interview arranged through family proximity. This was an evaluation, and he was behind. I didn't press further. There was no need. The absence of solid answers had already said more than any confrontation could. I closed my notebook and thanked him for his time. As he stood, his movements were slower, more careful. The confidence he'd brought in with him stayed behind, folded neatly between the chair and the floor. After he left, I remained seated for a moment, listening to the quiet return to the room. The recording light blinked off. The screen went dark. Outside that building, I knew my family still believed I worked in an office talking in abstractions. Inside it, decisions were made that morning that would ripple outward for years. I gathered my things and stood. The interview wasn't over yet, but the truth had already arrived. I didn't introduce myself properly before, and maybe that was deliberate. Names have a way of anchoring things, of making moments permanent. Mine is Elena Cross. I'm a clinical systems auditor trained in trauma medicine before I ever learned how to read spreadsheets and protocols the way other people read faces. For the past 11 years, my work has lived in the quiet spaces between policy and consequence, where a single decision can tilt the outcome of an entire ward. I've learned to speak slowly, to listen longer than people expect, to carry the weight without letting it show. The interview room was smaller than it needed to be. No windows. The air conditioner hummed too loud, like it was trying to fill the gaps in the conversation before they formed. Andrew sat across from me, shoulders squared, fingers laced tight on the table. He had rehearsed this. I could tell. People always do when they're afraid of being measured. I started with comparisons. Not accusations. Never those. I asked him how his experience aligned with Dr. Simone Parker's, how he would step into a role she once held without having walked any of the same ground. Simone had run a classified military medical initiative overseas, managing rotating teams under conditions that broke most people by month 3. Andrew shifted in his chair when I said her name. He knew the resume. Everyone in the field did. I asked about team leadership. He spoke in generalities, buzzwords, collaboration, vision. I waited. Silence has a way of pulling the truth to the surface. When it came, it was thin. He had never managed a research unit under pressure, never been responsible for lives outside a lab setting. He talked about delegation, but not accountability. That absence sat between us, solid and undeniable. Then I asked for independent work, original studies, peer-reviewed outcomes with his name alone at the top. He flipped a page in his folder slower than necessary. There weren't any. Co-authorships, yes. Contributions. Supporting roles. Important but not decisive. Not for what this position demanded. I marked it down, not with judgment, just precision. The room grew colder, or maybe I just noticed it more. Andrew's jaw tightened. His eyes didn't leave mine. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its polish. He said I was biased, that I was protecting a legacy instead of giving new talent a chance, that I was favoring people I admired over people who deserved it. I let him finish. I always do. When I spoke, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I'm protecting patient lives, I said. Not your ego. Not mine. The margin for error here is measured in heartbeats. The words landed heavier than I expected. Not because they were sharp, but because they were final. Andrew looked at the table then as if it might offer him another argument. It didn't. There was nothing left to say that would change the facts. The interview ended without ceremony. No handshake, no closing remarks. Just the soft click of my pen and the scrape of his chair as he stood. After he left, I stayed seated longer than necessary. I felt the familiar ache settle in my chest, the one that comes when you choose correctness over kindness, knowing you won't get